Say, I'm frightfully sorry to have disturbed you, but I thought you might want to know that there are fists in the hotel. He gestured down the corridor with his gun. Carl poked his head out and discovered a dead bellboy, sprawled out in front of an open door, still clutching a long knife. As it happens, I was already up, said Carl Hollywood, and contemplating a bit of a stroll to the waterfront. Care to join me? Delighted. Colonel Spence, Royal Joint Forces, retired. Carl Hollywood.
Look at you, you're so scruffy.
I'm very scruffy. I'm super scruffy. Yeah, I'm sort of like the stereotype of a man who's quit his job.
Hang on, you can't skate past the stereotype of a man who's quit his job without articulating for us just what that stereotype might be, in your opinion.
Well, I think there's a certain point where perhaps one maintains a kind of professional appearance for the sake of one's professional relationship, and then when one finds I'm using a lot of the one as my direct object.
I'm enjoying this like foray into the conditional,
into Victorian
or the subjunctive.
When one finds that one no longer needs to rely on such social relationships with one's tribe, one may choose to allow one's whiskers to grow. Yeah, I don't know. I sometimes grow a fall beard. My dad always grew a fall beard. I feel like it's very New England. You seem to have a fall beard growing, or have you had a beard this entire time?
I've had a beard this entire time. I more or less like have just a permanent beard now.
I feel like when we started, you had a mohawk. Am I remembering?
I still have a mohawk. It's just
maybe it's just the headphones.
The headphones,
or it's an outgrown.
One of my favorite lines from The Cherry Orchard. There is a character named Yeppy Kodoff who's sort of the like bumbling fool of the play. And there's this great line in a really good translation where he's like, "Take, for example, this mustache. It just grew here by itself." And you're like, and there's this like moment where you're like, well, yeah, like that's what mustaches do. And then I don't know, you just kind of circle around and like, is this a brilliant piece of writing? Is this an accident? It's just one of those Chekhovian mysteries that we'll never know.
The other thing that reminds me of is, we have a tentative plan to read Cryptonomicon next
in like 10 days.
Yeah. Well, we're dividing it into 3, but it's a long ass book. I have a recollection that one of the main characters' academic girlfriends wrote a academic essay on beards, and one of the arguments was a sort of counterintuitive argument about what was more natural, shaving or not shaving. It was a sort of academic argument about why beards are essentially bad, and it was represented as kind of a hilariously passive-aggressive way of complaining about her boyfriend's beard without actually doing it.
I mean, that's a page right out of the Fedland memo.
Yeah.
It's like the same sort of narrative conceit is like, well, shit, like what's the best way to make these people like feel bad about themselves? It's write this like marvelous 20-page memo about toilet paper.
I think satirizing forms of official writing is one thing Stephenson enjoys.
So, welcome in, listeners, to another episode of Upper Middlebrow. Tonight we are considering, for your entertainment, the second of Neal Stephenson's 1995 Dickensian neo-Victorian ambitious novel about education for the masses, nanotechnology, cryptocurrency, decentralized networks, wild nationalist rebellions, and
geopolitics.
Quite possibly the birth of the Seed, which we hear may be used for ill or for good. But in the nature that I think we'll talk about tonight, is sort of hand waved away at the very last moment.
The seed. Yeah, no, it's you and I texted a little bit about this, which is like he's got about 3 novel ideas in this novel, and the seed is one of them. I'll also say massive multiplayer games as well, which I'm not sure existed then. But if you think about the Mouse Army's incursion into the world of the Primer, sort of unexpected incursion, as I understand it, you basically have a massive multiplayer game happening, which is something that Stephenson in later novels becomes very fascinated with, for sure.
Also, the way that that the theater is played out on the Dramatis Personaeship, that is basically a lot like dropping into a World of Warcraft game where there's like a whole bunch of different like shows going on at once, and you sort of get to pick which ones that you are a part of. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves.
Dive in.
Well, let's.
Shall we dive in?
Let's turn to part the second. Boy, if a plot summary of part the first was hard, I'm not quite sure how we can pull this off in a small amount of time, but I think we should try.
Well, I really liked what you did last time, which was just name the characters and their arcs. And I think we could do that again. And I think one thing we can notice is that Judge Fang and his crew basically disappear. Gone.
like, which is attached to one of my questions that you might have seen in the notes about orphaned MacGuffins.
Well, and there are 2 characters who kind of play a similar role that Judge Fang and his crew, who either are introduced in part the second, or become more prominent in part the second. And one is Carl Hollywood, who goes kind of from minor character to major character.
Yeah. Who I cannot hear his name at any point without instantly flopping back to the movie Mystery Train, Night Train, Mystery Train. Which is it?
Jim Jarmusch.
The Jim Jarmusch. Is it Night Train or Mystery Train?
Mystery Train is set in
Mystery
Memphis.
Train.
Two like Japanese tourists walking around Memphis.
One of whom says, has this like ongoing conversation about who is better, Elvis Presley or Carl Perkins. And every time Carl Hollywood is mentioned in my brain, I hear Carl Perkins. There's something about the Carl and the Hollywood and Carl Perkins and Mystery Train that has just like shunted those like ways of thinking together in my brain.
I always imagine him as Kiefer Sutherland in Young Guns, because he's tall and blonde and has a duster.
Yes,
and it's interesting too because I think he's supposed to be a Southerner, like from New Orleans or something like that, and he is a I don't know. At first, I thought he was. Because his name is Carl Hollywood, I thought of him as kind of a scumbag. That's sort of a like porn star kind of scumbag, pimpy type name, right? And he's in, but he turns out to be kind of a mensch.
Central. Weirdly central to the success of the plot.
He kind of welds together what I see as the 2 plots. He's the character who, and then the other one who appears. Well, there's the constable who's kind of a minor character, and there's also Mrs. Matheson. And maybe we could say, so as one of the things that happens in part the second is that Harv and Nell escape their troubled domestic life and escape. We mentioned Dovetail, and they're sort of taken in, but Harv can't be taken in, and so he has to go back out on the streets, and Nell is taken in and starts going to a neo-Victorian school under the tutelage of Mrs. Matheson and some others, and then also has a new father figure in the constable, who also turns out to be kind of a retired freelance general who is, in his off hours is sort of propagating a land war in Asia, when he's, which is, again, a lot of plot. So we still have Nell, and we followed Nell and her 2 friends. She becomes friends with Fiona Hackworth and Elizabeth Finkel McGraw. And we kind of follow them into young adulthood to be about age 18 or so. Do you want to name some other character arcs?
The book, the second part of the book for John Percival Hackworth's arc, who's our other main arc, opens with him beginning to serve what we discover is his 10-year sentence to the Central Kingdom. That he was
very, very cryptically, though.
Yeah, he does not know that he is about to go
right
away for 10 years. He falls in with a file called the Drummers, which are basically a hive mind gestalt society that finds new members and brings them into their group through the transference of bodily fluids.
Underwater Burning Man.
Yeah. Underwater Burning Man. They inflate these amazing tunnels underneath the water. One of my things that I want to talk about tonight is the overlapping of book projects, because I was like, oh, here we are back with the, these are the cult prostitutes from Snow Crash. But the idea that information can be transmitted in a variety of means.
Virus.
But we learn... like a virus. We learned that Hackworth has been sent here by Dr. X basically so he can power the hive mind computations of the drummers in a way that will allow Dr. X to create something that is called the seed, which is kind of a doomsday object and also kind of a Deus Ex Machina object where one seed can grow into anything. It could grow into a hydrogen bomb. It could grow into food. It could grow into a Toyota Camry, for all we know. But it is basically, in sort of my reading of it, it is trying to do the opposite of what Hackworth has always been trying to do. Hackworth sort of believes that the way of the world is that order is assembled from less order. And the seed, to me, strikes me as a movement in the opposite direction, where there's a highly ordered thing that then can become anything. So Hackworth's quest is to find the alchemist. That is what Dr. X has sent him on. And we discover over the course of the second half of the book that Hackworth is the alchemist, and it is a combination of his brain, the drummer's gestalt hive mind, that is going to do the computational power to allow both the seed to come into being and to kind of break down what I'm pretty sure is a decentralized blockchain system, a la a cryptocurrency that powers the media net that is going to allow Miranda to find Neal. And again, we're back into Snow Crash land of basically what is information disaster? Is it the cutting off of information, or is it the opening up of information?
Yeah, and I think probably the other thing to mention is that towards the beginning of the second half, we shoot forward through time pretty quickly, and he is freed by his neo-Victorian spy handlers, who use some nanotechnology to allow him to get out. So Hackworth regains his agency in the second half of the book, and one of the things he does is reconnect with his daughter Fiona, who is a teenager. Gwen, his wife, wants nothing to do with him, but Fiona still loves him, and we learn that as he's been sort of hypnotized and unconscious, Hackworth has been sort of serving the role of narrator of his daughter Fiona's adventures with the Primer. So when she's spending time with the Primer, she's actually hearing Hackworth read to her, and so they've been able to maintain their relationship because of that.
Yeah. Why don't you tell us about the adventures of Princess Neal over the second half of the book? So Princess Neal is inside the Primer, but her development, it kind of parallels what sort of Hackworth's experience of discovering more. But take us through kind of her adventures with King Coyote.
Yeah, I have to admit, I didn't fully understand everything that was happening. So Princess Nell, her companions, her knight friends, one by one sort of die off as they become less useful to her, and I believe the primer wants her to become more independent. And so she starts going on a series of adventures in the primer where she's taken to these different castles. Castle touring is a fun one, where she basically has to determine whether is Count Turing, which is a giant man in armor, is a computer or not. And he also uses a code devised by Alan Turing using a series of chains. And so Nell is getting kind of tutored in some basic computer programming and also some concepts about artificial intelligence. I don't fully understand the King Coyote quest, to be honest. Do you understand it?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, like the second half of this book is a bit of a mess, and it's a bummer because I suspect that Neal Stephenson got bored, and we need the adventure with King Coyote, because we discover that King Coyote is in fact John Percival Hackworth in Nell's primer and the Mouse Army, which are the 250,000, probably up to 1/3 Chinese children. Well, and do we
think that King Coyote is a artificial construct of John Percival Hackworth, or does she actually kind of do like a Skype with John Percival Hackworth in that moment, where it actually communicates with it? Because that was one thing I didn't fully understand in that moment.
I think so. I do think that it's not a Skype, but it's another part of the kind of what the drummers have been have been able to like open up, that like Hackworth is kind of dropping into the primer in the same way that he dropped into Fiona's primer. And that's what I think is going on. And the reason we need it is kind of linked with that section where Carl Hollywood's hack, where he is sort of figuring out that John Percival Hackworth has basically come up with like the key to end all keys, which is the 12th key that King Coyote has.
And is the 12th key the seed, or is it something? I know that I don't quite understand what these keys are. I mean, you kind of get the sense that Nell is learning some precepts of computer programming, but the keys seem to have some plot significance that I don't fully track.
Yes, it has plot significance to the next book we're going to read, Cryptonomicon, because Neal Stephenson was clearly wrestling with the ideas that then become central to that book while he was still writing this one. That is a harsh judgment.
No, I think you're right.
I kind of suspect it's true. I think the 12th key is the key that is the thing that makes the seed possible.
I think that's right too. That seems right too, because there is, at the very end, there is sort of a like Frodo with the ring, putting the ring on, and there's a fight at at Mount Doom over the ring, at the very end of the book.
A really bland fight.
Yeah. Yeah,
it is confusing. It is a confusing second half of the book. I'm trying to think if there are other arcs that we need to touch base here. We know that Miranda, Nell's mother figure, who has been playing most of the parts of the primer, has also joined the drummers in a desire to find Nell. That's how she is sort of sold on it. As these two members
again,
of Cryptonet.
I find this part confusing. I don't quite understand what it is they're trying to get her to do and why they need her. But yes, they have some proposition by which Miranda can find Nell. Miranda's become very attached to Nell, and basically considers herself Nell's mother at this point. And
I think the big come together is Dr. X gets all of these hundreds of thousands of primers from John Percival Hackworth. They work well, but they don't work perfectly. In some ways, this book is a big argument for traditional family structure. Because it's like, or not, maybe not traditional family structure, but like you better have
or somebody. It doesn't have to be your biological mom. And I mean, I think this is what we talk about with Justin too, which is interesting,
right?
True. Because I think a lot of people maybe misunderstand the argument with regard to the efficacy of the primer.
Yeah, but I think what's happening is that Nell's relationship to the primer is special in a way that the CryptNet people and Dr. X, who are looking for the seed, recognize that they need Nell, the primer, Miranda, Hackworth, and the drummers all to be kind of connected in a very coincidental and sort of plot of a novel manner, in order to get the thing to make the seed work. All of that stuff has to function together for that to occur. But I understand your confusion, and I've been having it too. This novel is oblique in frustrating ways.
So the other major plot thing that happens too is a much easier plot to track, although it's done largely by implication, but essentially there's conflict between the Celestial Kingdom and the Coastal Kingdom, Shanghai. Coastal Kingdom, we're meant to understand, is more modernized and sort of cosmopolitan and liberal, and the Celestial Kingdom is kind of nationalistic and conservative and resents this sort of new world. The Celestial Kingdom wins, or at least overruns Shanghai with its sort of mob/army called the Fists of Harmonious Nature.
Fists of celestial,
fists of
something. It doesn't.
They mostly just call them the
doesn't
fists.
matter.
They're young men who basically attack anybody they perceive as immoral or not Han Chinese or both. And there's also a regular army that has some relationship to Dr. X, and the Mandarins of the Celestial Kingdom, and they essentially, in a very sort of relatively traditional way, there's nano warfare happening, but there's also just regular old, territorial warfare happening, slowly are approaching Shanghai for the final chapters, where Carl Hollywood finds himself, where Nell finds herself, where Hackworth finds himself, and it leads to a kind of final series of events in Shanghai and then sort of on the coast as the army is closing in, and there are hundreds of thousands of refugees who are facing slaughter at the hands of these armies who, need to be rescued and make their way to New Chuzan. And that kind of forces the sort of last few chapters, which I found very enjoyable. And it is one of those things with Stephenson where often you can read it at one level and sort of enjoy the kind of action adventure story and only kind of understand some of the other things that are happening. And, but I mean, we didn't do the most amazing recap, but I think we nailed all the threads, right?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of questions, but listener, it's a wild ride.
Extremely
it's an interesting
ambitious
ride.
novel. I would say more ambitious than Snow Crash.
Yeah, I think so, and I think more ambitious than Cryptonomicon too. But we'll see when we get to Cryptonomicon about that. I think this one is trying to do so many things that I really appreciate and applaud it for doing. But yeah, so you've got an observation. We talked about Bud's opening chapter last time. It looks like you've got
I posed the question, why did we have that opening chapter? Because we both agree that it functions, but it's no Deliberator chapter, right? Or at least it's if it's trying to be a Deliberator chapter, it maybe gets a B+, right? But it whereas the Deliberator chapter's an A, and so why start with this guy? And it, to me now, it's sort of more clear to me, the plot that I enjoy the most, and we'll talk more about this in our bonus episode, I enjoy the Nell's pedagogy, Nell's education, Nell's coming of age, and all the different foils for Nell. including her two friends who are her age, who have the primers, including the 500,000 Chinese girls, the Mouse Army, who also have the primer, including Harv, her brother, who is morally a much better person than their father Bud, but also does not get exposed to particularly nurturing or wholesome culture production. In fact, he spends his time, this was another thing, I looked up when Grand Theft Auto was invented, the video game, because he seems to be playing something very similar to GTA 3.
Oh my God, you're right.
His entertainment is basically robbing. It's a video game, sort of immersive virtual reality game where he is a criminal who runs around, and like there's a quest he has to go on where he's helping his girlfriend get an abortion pill, and he has to mug some Victorians, and then in order to do that, and then he feels bad when he's describing this to Nell because she's sort of Victorian at this point, and he realizes that's not appropriate. It's very sad, actually. But then there's also, I think Bud and Tequila, I think we're meant to understand, are where maybe Nell and Harv would end up if it weren't for the primer. And if it also weren't for maybe another ineffable quality they have, which is their loyalty to one another, too. So Nell has two great strengths, and one is her relationship to Harv, who is her protector, and then the things that she learns in the primer, and then she develops her own strength. And so I think I think the Bud chapter, it becomes especially important when you think about where Nell might have ended up otherwise, too. So that was something that occurred to me in the second half that did not occur to me in the first half, too, which is that Bud is another foil for Nell. And if we're thinking of this book as a book about what people might become, all men start out the same but diverge. I think it does make sense to start with the Bud chapter. And that wasn't something I had thought of the last time we talked.
No, it's a great observation. I mean, we get there in the second half of the book when the fists get some better ammunition, and they do manage to blow up the causeway between the mainland and Shanghai, the Central Coast Republic. We do get a image of poor people using the funeral piers and like rolling like hundreds of bodies, like little cigarettes, off of the funeral piers into the water. And it's one of those things where it's like, that is such a strength of Stephenson's that he does bring that detail back, because that's one of those moments when you're like, oh, right. Like, boy, shit could be much
By
worse.
the way, I think that Shanghai is on the mainland, and the causeway goes from Shanghai to New Chuzan, which is the artificial island that includes New Atlantis and the leased territories.
I did some searches for Diamond Age map and did not come up with anything.
This point, but it took me a while. At one point, they also refer to Source Victoria as being on the Central Plateau, which I noticed as well. So I now have kind of a map of New Chuzan in my head, but it took a fair amount of attention. Because I went back and read several passages. I didn't read the book twice, but I probably read the book about 1.5 times to prepare.
Yeah, exactly. There were some chapters where I was like, okay, I've got to listen to the play on the boat again. I was like, that seemed really central and I was like, something crucial happened. And then when I went back and read it again, I was like, oh, something crucial did happen. It was just lampshaded.
Yeah.
Like something, there's this moment where he basically decides to get in the water, and then there's a paragraph break, and then he's out of the water, and it's the next day, and we're like,
I meant to mention this last time, and I didn't put a bullet point here, but this is the thing that annoys me about this book, and annoys me about Stephenson sometimes, which is that he's really, really good at writing surreal moments from a first-person perspective that are entertaining, weird, confusing, and then later, and it could be 500 pages later, explains them for you, which is great and it's satisfying, but often those explanations, and especially in this book, are just the sort of like, they're just sort of like, and then I realized in an instant that I was the alchemist, and suddenly I know what was happening all along. And there's a moment like that with what's the name of the intelligence Finkel McGraw's friend, the intelligence officer,
Major, and then later
Napier.
Colonel Napier.
There's a moment where, we have all these weird, surreal scenes with the drummers, and you have no idea what it's going on. And then Hackworth emerges, and they've basically given him they basically, like, gave him a shot of penicillin, a nanobot that, like, clears it all out of his system. And Napier's just sort of like, well, old boy, let me explain what was just happening to you. You see, you were hallucinating the entire time, and drummers were using your brain power in order to get you to do certain things. And it's like very, very complex, very, very strange, and then just like sudden expositional reveal in a way that's a bit clumsy. But just like Stephenson's like, I gotta kind of tell the reader what was going on there. How can I do that? I don't know. Napier can just say it. Or, as happened multiple times in this book, a character can have a sudden sort of Sherlock Holmes-like realization of everything. And they're like, I finally pieced it together. Hackworth is constantly like finally piecing it together. And then, sort of, he does it with Dr. X. He does it at that moment too. I think he does it with Napier one time. It's a little bit annoying.
Yeah, it's that is, I wish. This is one of those things where, and this kind of leads into my next question about possible book overlapping. I would love to. I would, he's written a lot in his career. I would trade, and I'm saying this is bad. I'm betting with money that I don't have, because I haven't read a bunch of the later ones. I would trade 2 Neal Stephenson novels out of existence for him to spend an additional 4 to 6 months on the ones that remain.
I would take that because you could get rid of termination shock, and also you could get rid of the Baroque cycle, which is entertaining, but I don't know. I don't think I'll ever read it again.
But yeah, I would love to know what the writing schedule was like, because I'm kind of starting to think Snow Crash and the Diamond Age and Cryptonomicon all had at least some overlap.
Yeah, interesting.
And I think there's probably less overlap between Snow Crash and the Diamond Age. There's echoes of the ideas of information being transmitted like viruses or like religions or stuff like that. The drummers are a clear case of that. But the whole Alan Turing section, I was like, Jesus, we're going to do this again in 2 weeks when we read all of this Alan Turing stuff in Cryptonomicon.
There's also a lot of Shanghai stuff in Cryptonomicon, too. It's like, which I will say that this book made me want to go to Shanghai and like go to the Bund and check out like the old sort of like English Quarter and stuff like that. The other thing is, did you catch the reference that actually explicitly suggests this book is in the same continuity to Snow Crash?
Yes, you did. Yes, I did. You sent me a text of it, and I was like in Kona and exhausted and overwhelmed, and I was like, yeah, it's a fucking line from Snow Crash. And then like I was on a bike ride a day or two later, and then was like, holy shit, now I get it.
Well,
like,
which is funny because like you probably actually encountered chiseled spam in Hawaii, right? Like Hawaii is a place where they actually chisel spam.
Yeah, tell us about how chiseled spam reappears in this book, and then give the listeners a call back to where it popped up in Snow Crash.
Right. So it's actually a lovely chapter, and I actually think I'd like to talk about this chapter in the bonus pedagogy discussion. It appears with Mrs. Matheson when she's talking with Fiona and Nell, who I think at this point are maybe like 15 or 16 years old, and they're starting to have a lot of tension with a very strict teacher named Mrs. Stricken. And Mrs. Matheson, who's very, very old, is rolling along on a wheelchair, and she's observing the smart wheels of her wheelchair, and she mutters to herself, chiseled spam. And the two girls say, what are you talking about? And she says, oh, nothing, just remembering an advertisement from my youth. You know I used to be a thrasher. And in that moment, we learn that Mrs. Matheson was either a peer and contemporary of YT, the skateboard delivery, or could actually be YT. That is a possibility. Although
I wish it were that. I strongly suspect it's the former, not the latter.
YT would have had to become very socially conservative in her old age. Although we have the sense that Mrs. Matheson, is worldly and cosmopolitan and has chosen this sort of socially conservative tribe, but is maybe more open-minded than many of the neo-Victorians. And of course, it's a reference to the smart wheels that YT purchases. And at one point, I think Stephenson writes the advertisement that YT watched that prompted her to purchase the smart wheels, which is like, do you want to end up like chiseled spam?
Yeah.
If not,
chiseled spam is what you'll see in the mirror if you're not rolling like whatever the smart wheels
the smart wheels are, right? Yeah. So there's this, and it, obviously it's a little bit of an Easter egg, and you could imagine the Snow Crash world being a predecessor of this world if they thought about that era as sort of a dark age, and they do. Yeah. They sort of that is part of what the neo-Victorians are sort of a response to the Snow Crash era of kind of, anarchic, ultra-violent ethnic feuding ethnic enclaves.
Yeah, I think you're right. Last time, I think I expressed some skepticism, but
Me too.
But now, like with this in the book, it's one of those writerly things where, like, it is. If it's not, then this is a prank. This is an in joke, and Stephenson is a better writer than that.
Yeah,
he wouldn't just stick it in here as a piece of graffiti, basically.
Yeah. But they are different styles of book, though, right? Yeah,
they sure are. But I'm convinced. I'm like, this couldn't. It's such a specific. It's such a specific reference.
Yeah.
It talks about the exact wheels.
Yeah. No, he's telling us this. Yeah. And in the context, she says she was a thrasher. She rode a skateboard around too. I mean, he's telling us this is the future of Snow Crash.
Yeah. So I think it's my brain has a hard time putting those worlds together and making sense of the handoff. It just seems like a lot of a lot of change. It doesn't seem to be a huge amount of time. And
maybe 60 years, something like that, 60 or 70
yeah,
years.
that's a lot of geopolitical and social change.
But keep in mind, Snow Crash is really only set in North America. And Stephenson makes it clear in Snow Crash that America has the worst economy in the world now because of its collapsed sort of hyper-capitalism. And so, it doesn't really speak to what's happening in the rest of the world.
There is a reference in Snow Crash that you can ship things around the world on a dirigible for a nickel. And a dirigible is probably going to be the antecedents of these mysterious airships that, again, Stevenson's like, yeah, whatever. We don't need to describe that. They get you. They get you from here to there in very little time.
I do remember he describes that the technology is vacuum. So rather than using lighter than air gas, they have some kind of material. And of course, if diamond is now cheaper than glass, you can imagine that they can make some kind of blimp material that you can pump out, turn into a vacuum. And it is. Dirigibles are cheap, and they don't. If you can propel them, if you solve the safety problem, they're a really great, transportation system.
Yeah. I'm going to jump to my question about orphaned MacGuffins.
Yeah.
A lot of the first half of the book centers around Dr. X and the wonderful Judge Feng.
Yeah.
Sort of manipulating Hackworth eventually into a place where he has to hand over the technology of the primer to educate the 500,000 Han Chinese girls that otherwise would be exposed to the elements and left to die.
Right. Which Hackworth does willingly. Comes to agree that is a noble and virtuous use of the primer.
Yeah. And there is, and I can't tell. There's a moment when Hackworth is agreeing to that, where the book says that Hackworth basically tricked Dr. X without even knowing that he was doing it. And it's not explicated in that moment. But then in the second half of the book, we bump into a moment where Dr. X and Hackworth are once again reunited. And Dr. X is like, oh, that was a mistake.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what the like, hold on.
And he says, and Hackworth actually pushes back, right? And says, how could you say that was a mistake? And Dr. X has to sort of hem and haw a little bit. And he says, well, obviously trying to help those girls was the right thing to do. But essentially, without having a kind of human mentor attached to the primer, it just didn't work as well or something like that.
And what frustrates me about it is that is a huge MacGuffin that has powered the narrative of the first half, which is completely abandoned for this MacGuffin of the seed, which is what powers the narrative of the second half.
Which, if I recall, doesn't even really exist in the first half, right?
Pretty much. I mean, I bet if we were doing a slightly deeper or more careful reading, we would pick up some references to it. But this kind of goes with your sense of like, this is two different novels.
Yeah.
And I am frustrated by the orphaned MacGuffin of basically 500,000 who do come back to play an important role. But the fact that this whole thing that we've invested time and attention in, Dr. X is sort of like, oh, that was a mistake.
Yeah, and of course we don't see Dr. Fang again, Judge Fang again, and his sidekicks. They're gone. I mean, there are enough sci-fi premises to write 7 novels, right? Like The Drummers is a premise. The Diamond Age, just the geopolitical situation, just the pedagogy of the primer. But to me, there's sort of 2 major plots, and one is the education of Princess Nell, the education of Nell. That's one plot, and then the other is the sort of end game of the seed versus the feed. The sort of 2 technologies, and what we're learning is Dr. X is trying to free China from the feed, which is basically like cheap or free matter replicators, but on the Western world's terms.
And it's like a weird Barsoom scoop. That like some this'll resurface. It's like I can't remember if it's Heinlein or Niven, but there's enough like floating hydrogen in the vacuum of space that if you get a scoop that is really fucking big, that you can get enough hydrogen to basically power a cascading series of nuclear reactions to speed yourself up close to the speed of light. Turning around is always, that's always the problem, slowing down. But it seems that the feed basically sucks in elements from the environment and turns it into, because we hear that it's a series of elements,
right?
And different cultures mix it differently. So some you get like a lot of phosphorus, and the feed is really burns really bright, and it's another again, like you give Neal Stephenson like a scientific conceit, you're going to get a lovely literary passage out of it,
right? But it's a utility. Yeah. It's right, something that is conveyed sort of like a gas main in a pipe, right?
Yeah, totally.
But it's matter. And the capacity to make, as we learned and we discussed last time, mattresses or food or, a knife or a gun or basically anything. But Dr. X has a really interesting complaint with it. And actually I have a reading about that I may do at some point if we get there. Yeah. But to me, that's its own interesting novel. And these two plots are tack welded together in a way that to me feels, I don't know, it's I can't tell if it's done with just tremendous craft and I'm just kind of stupid that I'm having a hard time tracking the keys and Princess Nell, and I mean, he has welded them together, right? Like there is the causal relationship between the two plots, and Carl Hollywood and Hackworth. But I can also imagine each of those plots existing independently. Like you could have a novel, I think, that was really just based on everything that was introduced in the first half of the book. The primer,
yes,
the files, the I don't even know that you need the nano warfare, to be honest. This is another thing I find a little bit confusing too, is that we're meant to understand that Hackworth is a nano engineer, right? And yet Hackworth is the designer of the book, which is a sort of genius application of artificial intelligence technology, sort of filtering mythology and everything we know about human education. Where's the nano engineering in that? It's a tablet,
yeah,
with a really powerful AI. As far as I can tell, that's what the book is.
Yeah,
and so
then's bolted on to some human interaction. But
right.
You're right. There's a lot of I don't know what I would. This is what I would. It's not derisive, but I would sort of call like shell game like authoring.
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of like, this thing is happening, don't look behind the curtain. Right. Well, like we don't get to really see how the sausage is made in this particular novel.
Yeah.
And I don't know, the analogy that keeps coming up to me is like, whenever you do something in the world, like anything, you do that thing, you also create a massive amount of wasted heat at the same time. This book feels inefficient in that way. I don't think it's because you're not reading carefully. I think it's because it's just too big, and he didn't dedicate the time to knitting everything together in the second half. I'm completely with you. I think there is a way to have this book about 2/3 the length.
Yeah. And I don't know that you need the seed plot at all. I mean, it's interesting. I could see a whole other novel that sort of seed versus feed and kind of gets in. I mean, Stevenson's fascinated with anthropology and sort of like clash of civilizations too, and I'm fascinated with. Actually, can I do this reading now? This is sort of like Dr. X's complaint with the feed. I found this moment really interesting. See if I have it marked well. Is this it? Yeah. There's this confrontation between Hackworth and Dr. X. It's got some great Stephenson writing leading up to it of Hackworth, who either A, has a kind of like free pass to go see Dr. X, and the fists all know this, or B, is behaving like a madman, and in China, madmen have a kind of respect such that they're allowed to go everywhere. It's sort of not clear which, or maybe it's a little bit of both. But we have the sense that he has safe passage, and so he shows up, and what we were meant to understand is that Hackworth has mostly completed engineering the seed when he was sort of dreaming and unconscious, part of this Gestalt consciousness, but he hasn't quite finished. And so Dr. X really wants Hackworth to finish the seed, and Hackworth says, "Why do you need it?" Hackworth said, "We must have technology to live," Dr. X said, "but we must have it with our own tea." Hackworth thought for a moment that Dr. X was referring to the beverage, but the doctor began to trace characters on the tabletop, his hand moving deftly and gracefully, the brocade sleeve rasping across the plastic surface. Yang is the outer manifestation of something. Tea is the underlying essence. Technology is a yang associated with a particular tea. That is, the doctor stumbled here, through a noticeable effort refrained from using pejorative terms like barbarian or guelo. That is Western and completely alien to us. For centuries since the time of the Opium Wars, we have struggled to absorb the yang of technology without importing the Western tea. But it has been impossible. Just as our ancestors could not open our ports to the West without accepting the poison of opium, we cannot open our lives to the Western technology without taking in Western ideas, which have been as a plague on our society. The result has been centuries of chaos. We ask you to end that by giving us the seed. I do not understand why the seed will help you. The seed is a technology rooted in the Chinese tea. We have lived by the seed for 5,000 years, Dr. X said. He waved his hand toward the window. By the way, they're in a McDonald's having this meeting right now.
Right.
There were rice paddies before there were parking lots. Rice was the basis for our society. Peasants planted the seed and had the highest status in the Confucian hierarchy. As the master said, let the producers be many and the consumers few. When the feed came in from Atlantis, from Nippon, we no longer had to plant because the rice now came from a matter compiler. It was the destruction of our society. When our society was based upon planning, it could truly be said, as the master said, virtue is the root, wealth is the result. But under the Western tea, wealth comes not from virtue, but from cleverness. So the filial relationships have become deranged. Chaos, Dr. X said regretfully, then looking up from his tea and nodded out the window. Parking lots and chaos.
That last bit is such a Stephenson line.
Yeah, and I don't know. Maybe I want to read. Is it Edward Said who wrote Orientalism? I mean, I wonder if Stevenson's doing a nickel dime sort of anthropological analysis of Chinese culture here. But he's well read. What I do like about it is that up until this moment, the Celestial Kingdom and the Fists have really behaved badly, and they seem like the bad guys and the antagonists. And this is a nice moment where I think we're meant to understand Dr. X and the Celestial Kingdom. They have a valid complaint, that this matter compiling technology it's been superimposed on their culture in a way that's not working out for them. And I enjoy that. I think that's... And I like that. I like a moment of it's not just good guys and bad guys, that there are struggles between two great forces. And, maybe the Fists are wrong, to rape and pillage their way into Shanghai. They are wrong. But maybe they have a valid cultural complaint too.
Yeah, I mean, this book is an interesting examination of two different kinds of post-scarcity cultures and the bad things that happen even in a post-scarcity culture. Like, there are still plenty of poor people in post-scarcity cultures. They're just not dying every day from
starvation,
or from starvation,
malnutrition, or lack of medicine.
Yeah. And it's funny. So many science fiction books have some kind of nod towards a post-scarcity world because it does solve a lot of narrative issues for you.
Yeah.
All of the Expanse books, which are good. I really enjoy those. On Earth, you can elect to just go on basic, it's called. And basically you're given enough money to just kind of get by.
Yeah.
And you're not poor, but it doesn't furnish you with any capital to do anything more with your life. And I think that is always that does pop up a lot in science fiction books, because at some point you have to be like, it helps you get beyond the like, well, how does this actually work?
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Yeah. Although it's kind of a little bit disappointing that, at least in this book, the only solution anybody comes up with is sort of a version of ethnic nationalism. Or if it's not ethnic nationalism, it's like an affinity group based on, some kind of... But it's basically like, find your people and then be kind of chauvinistic. Once you do. Whether you're the Neo-Victorian or the Han Chinese or Nippon or Hindustan, the four great tribes.
I think that's where we get some of Stevenson's worldview reflected in his work, because it just keeps coming up,
Yeah.
It comes up a lot in Snow Crash. It comes up a lot in this book. It is discussed quite a bit in Zodiac in ways that we kind of talked about previously, and we're like, I don't know if you can assign cultural qualities based on a reading of the restaurants in Boston.
Yeah. No, and he's. I mean, he's certainly informed. And the wisest characters are characters like Mrs. Matheson, who at one point says, she's like, the New Atlantis is a perfectly good tribe, and she's not chauvinistic. And I think this is where Stephenson's coming from. It's sort of. It doesn't really matter, there are many good tribes that you could pick, but you really ought to pick one. And there's a very explicit, Mrs. Matheson makes that argument. It basically says you can be clever, you can be talented, but unless you combine your efforts with those of a tribe, you won't succeed in this world, and this world is very dangerous. And that point is reinforced when Nell goes out on her own and, goes to work for becoming the story consultant for a brothel in Shanghai.
I know, it's wonderful. I love that section with Colonel Napier where Nell is kind of like, do this now.
Yeah.
It's kind of like weirdly directing this strange sexual encounter from on high.
I love that. I'd forgotten about that. It is very well written. And I love also when this is happening and they get assaulted by fists and Colonel Napier sort of snaps out of the fantasy and it has this moment where he suddenly goes back to being Colonel Napier and takes control and takes command and you're kind of not entirely clear whether because the thing that Nell suggests is a sort of fourth wall breaking narrative trope where I can't remember her exact suggestion, but it's something that suggests that maybe something is broken down and what was a fantasy that he was paying for, something's gone wrong. And now, I can't remember exactly what it was. But then
it's like cryptnet operatives are like coming for.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, that's right. We're not really prostitutes. We're actually cryptnet operatives, and we're torturing you. And then he loves that. He's enjoying it. But then when the fists actually attack, he's able to distinguish the fake something's going wrong in the brothel from the real something's going wrong in the brothel, and then kind of becomes a hero in that moment.
I'm really intrigued by this question of implied plot versus scene.
I kind of alluded to it earlier, but it is more specifically. So there's the thing I alluded to earlier, which is I don't know how you would exactly term this in literary terms, but it's first person experience of something that is bizarre to the point where maybe the reader even wonders if it's a hallucination. And to make it matters even worse with Stephenson, sometimes it is a hallucination. Sometimes it's not. And so, I mean, one of the great examples of this kicks off part the second, which is the orgy sex ritual where something like 12 young men in glowing condoms with the tips cut off, exposing their engorged glands, all have sex with a woman who then catches on fire. And you don't... why that happens is not explained for something like 300 pages. But eventually...
almost towards the end.
Eventually, that is revealed to not be because during this time, Hackworth is dreaming, right? So this could be a dream. It could be a hallucination. It's not a dream. It's not an hallucination. It becomes something very important. So that's one example. But there's also things that happen where the two examples I can come up with are Harv has to leave Nell because essentially Dovetail can't take in Harv for political reasons. Also, Hackworth, at the beginning of Part the Second, gets on a mechanical horse, rides into a grove, walks into the sea, and disappears. And in both cases, several pages go by, and then in very small ways, we're given to understand that Hackworth is still missing some years later in a scene with Gwen, his wife, and Lord Finkel McGraw. And we're also given to understand that Harv is still alive, and Nell is has been visiting him from time to time. But in both cases, a lot of action takes place before we're even getting these illusions. And so it's just sort of, I do think there's the first example of what I'm talking about, which is the surreal moment. But there are also these moments where we just lose track of a character, and then you're just given a little bit of a hint. And you have to piece together what that character has been going through for the last 7 years. In the case of Harv, we don't see Harv for 200, 300 pages, and then he turns up in a Catholic sanatorium with terrible asthma, which makes sense given he's living on the streets in the least territories and there are nano wars going on. But none of that's explained. And I guess I just have a question about, do you find that powerful, or do you find it a little bit is this part of the sloppiness we're talking about, or is this actually a well-honed craft, which is you can sometimes leave a narrative thread, pick it up later, and let the listener fill in what's happened?
I think it can be, for sure. I think that there are a lot of places where it is done really well. I think it is done here often enough that actually the effect is the novel begins to drift out of focus. There's just too many details and too much sort of like, all right, everybody, we're going 10 years ahead. There's a little too much of that there's a little too much hand waving and lamp shading.
Well, and I think I agree, and especially with your observation about orphan MacGuffins, because this is not an author at this phase in his career who we can necessarily trust to tell us what's going to happen to Harv. And so you don't know, did I miss something? Did I accidentally read a paragraph too fast? Or is that the end of Harv? Or should I keep thinking in the back of my mind, what's happening to Harv? What's happening to Harv? In that case, you do get a very satisfying scene where what's happened to Harv is answered in actually one of the most poignant moments in the entire book, I think. Very sad, humorous, sad. Harv is a great example of somebody with a noble soul who just does not get the mentorship and education he deserves, and thus becomes an extremely tragic character. And yes, he's done some things wrong, but at the same time, he has no role model whatsoever. So yeah, I think I agree with your conclusion.
And I think the biggest offense of that is the moment on the Dramatis Personae ship where Hackworth is like, "All right, I've got to go take part in this play," and then it takes place in a paragraph break.
Yeah, I mean, I think that scene is also an example of, like, I don't know if Stephenson took acid or, did a bump of blow before writing that, but if I were to learn that did happen, it would not be particularly surprising. But it's like the Dramatis Personae performance is this sort of wonderful funhouse. It reminds me of like Frank Miller sort of Batman and Joker graphic novel of like, what's up, what's down, like, where are you? There's a robotic Cockney clown making body rhymes. So I do feel like that's one of those cases where Stephenson got really carried away by just the depiction of that moment. Again, that sort of first person. Hackworth of all the characters is the one who often feels like he is on a funhouse ride and just being sort of taken through the funhouse, and he's sort of trying to make sense of what's going on.
Yeah, and there's a parallel to Snow Crash, and we sort of felt that about Hero as well, where like Hero begins to just be kind of like the funhouse ride that moves the plot forward, but YT becomes the character that we're actually interested in and invested in a character way, in a very similar way that we are with Neal in this book.
Yeah, although Hackworth is a little more. Yeah, Hackworth is interesting because Hackworth's agency. So, at the very beginning of the novel, he does something to express agency and to gain autonomy, and then that proves to be wrong, immoral, illegal. He's punished for it by having his agency taken away, and then the second half of the book, he's kind of gradually getting it back. And I think that is kind of an interesting. So Hackworth becomes interesting for that reason. Although the ending, I don't know, I don't quite
the ending is a problem. The ending is just not like if Dr. X is so committed to getting the seed and is allied with the Middle Kingdom, who have just taken over Shanghai, and Dr. X knows about the drummers, knows that they exist, know that they're there. He has an army literally like up there, and the book ends with something about like the drummers could wait, decades if necessary, for the seed to be delivered. And I'm like, no fucking way is Dr. X going to back off at this moment and not keep the pressure on.
My understanding was that essentially Neal, by rescuing Miranda, also kind of purged the drummer's ability to finish the seed technology at that moment. Like, she introduced some kind of nanosite into their bodily fluids that kind of essentially like deleted the seed hard drive at that point. That's a metaphor, but
my reading was that she deleted it basically from Miranda, and then that we get that image that's like the drummers were patient; they could wait, ages if necessary.
Well, but the idea was that they were about to basically consummate, basically put together all of the data, all of the nanocytes into Miranda's body, which would cause her to burn to death, but would also be the kind of final processing equation of the program that's creating the seed. Exactly, and that was thwarted. Oh, and then you're saying so, but they didn't necessarily need Miranda. They could find another Miranda, and they could do it again.
And it seems like it seems like a real like, I don't know how to finish this up. Let's go home, everybody.
Well, and as your understanding, at one point we see the man with the bowler hat walk into the water. Is that Hackworth throwing his lot in with Dr. X and the drummers and agreeing to help them in that moment? Or is that Hackworth committing suicide? Or is that...
I think it's him. I think it's just him going with Nell and Miranda and Nell
or he's joining the refugees and escaping Shanghai.
That's what
and going to take the tunnels to New Chuzan. Okay. Yeah, I was a little confused by it. So I couldn't tell if because he certainly was... He certainly was swayed, or I should say, he was certainly influenced by Dr. X's argument about the tea. Yeah. But was he swayed?
Right.
Unclear. Can I read my sort of favorite Victorian passage? So this is a moment where Carl Hollywood is in a hotel. He's now become a neo-Victorian. And the fists, something is detonated in the hotel, and he has the impression that the fists are attacking the hotel, and he decides it's time to leave and go to the dock and try to get some transportation to New Chuzon. And he goes and finds this old retired English colonel who he had met the other day, Colonel Spence. And Colonel Spence and Carl Hollywood both have kind of like 19th or early 20th century era weaponry, like revolvers.
They've got slug throwers.
Colonel Spence is at the door, knocks on the door, and Carl Hollywood answers, and Spence says, "Say, I'm frightfully sorry to have disturbed you, but I thought you might want to know that there are fists in the hotel." He gestured down the corridor with his gun. Carl poked his head out and discovered a dead bellboy, sprawled out in front of an open door, still clutching a long knife. "As it happens, I was already up," said Carl Hollywood, "and contemplating a bit of a stroll to the waterfront. Care to join me?" "Delighted. Colonel Spence, Royal Joint Forces, retired." Carl Hollywood. On their way down the fire stairs, Spence killed 2 more hotel employees who he had, on somewhat ambiguous grounds, identified as fists. Carl was skeptical in both cases until Spence ripped their shirts open to reveal the scarlet girdles beneath. "It's not that they're really fists, you see," Spence explained jovially. "Just that when the fists come, this sort of nonsense becomes terribly fashionable." After exchanging some more self-consciously dry humor about whether they should settle their bills before departure and how much you were supposed to tip a bellboy who came after you with a carving knife, they agreed it might be safest to exit through the kitchens. Half a dozen dead fists littered the floor there, their bodies stripped with the marks of cookie cutters. Arriving at the exit, they found 2 fellow guests, both Israelis, staring at them with the fixed gaze that implies the presence of a skull gun. Seconds later, they were joined by 2 Zulu management consultants carrying long telescoping poles with nanoblades affixed to the ends, which they used to destroy all of the light fixtures in their path. It took Carl a minute to appreciate their plan. They were all about to step out into a dark alley, and they would need their night vision. To me, it's pure fun, and the presence of the Zulus to me seemed like a little bit of a clue, a little bit of a cipher, because this scene, and there's another bit a little bit later where Carl Hollywood has a moment of clarity regarding sort of this Victorian stiff upper lip or this Victorian bravado, which is that it's not about pretending you're not afraid. It's a face-saving way of sort of making these sort of stiff jokes about, oh, should we tip the bellboy who just came after? How much is appropriate? If he comes after you with a knife, I'd say that's terribly poor service. I say, that sort of humor is it's not intended to fool anybody into making you think that, in making them think that you're not afraid. It's sort of a face-saving way of admitting that you're afraid. And the reference to the Zulu reminds me of the Michael Caine film, I think from the late 1960s, Zulu, which is full of this sort of thing. It's full of sort of... And so I think there's a little bit of a tip of the hat to Zulu there. It also reminds me, and it's ridiculous, and what follows is a kind of adventure novel shootout. Let's all get to the docks, and eventually they run into some boars, and they all make their way to the docks, and they're having a melee with the fists and others, and it's violent, it's kind of adventure story, it's prurient.
It's hero on the raft.
Yeah,
it's the final section of Zodiac. Always boats.
There's always a boat. There's a moment though, because Colonel Spence doesn't make it. And he's very brave, and he's sort of, there's depictions of him getting wounded and shooting the fist, who wounds him, and throughout, Carl Hollywood is kind of carrying him down, and the entire time his lips are flapping with this Victorian banter. And it really reminds me of the climactic scene in the John Huston movie, The Man Who Would Be King. I don't know if you're familiar with the film, where Sean Connery's character, Daniel Dravit, at one point says to Peachy Carnahan, played by Michael Caine, "Peachy, can you ever forgive me for being so bleeding high and so bloody mighty and getting us both killed?" To which Peachy replies, "Danny, that I can, that I do, freely and fully." "Well, everything's all right then." And they go off to their doom together. And I always weep at that moment, even though these guys are not good guys. They're engaged in a colonial project, and they're basically trying to defraud a bunch of Afghans and steal their gold. What they're doing is not good, but there's something about that sort of male bonding, stiff upper lip going into danger that I just find very, very charming.
Yeah, those were some of my favorite sections of the second half of the book. It's straightforward, it's funny, it's heartfelt, it's caring. Carl has to write a letter to Spence's widow. That's a really sweet moment. And yeah, it really is like, in all of the mayhem of trying to discern the plot and its agents, the whole section of Shanghai getting invaded, I really loved.
And it also fits into this theme, too, which is one of the main ideas about the Neo-Victorians, which is that they're all kind of doing it with a wink and a nod, right? That they're not actual Victorians. These are people basically who responded to an age of chaos by adapting a very strict moral code, but they're all worldly. And so they're doing it with a kind of sense of irony, too, which is also very 1990s. And it's interesting, and Stephenson's fascinated by that. Want to do trivia?
Yeah, let's do some trivia.
You want me to go first? Okay. The landmass that contains Source Victoria, New Atlantis, Dovetail, and the Least Territories is an island called New Chuzan. I think we're meant to understand that New Chuzan is a nanotechnology created artificial island, and one assumes it refers to some place called Chuzan. So what was presumably OG Chuzan? And it's multiple choice.
Okay, thank God.
One is it's a Mandarin name for the island that contains the city Hong Kong, Hong Kong being a Cantonese name. So that's A. B, it is an island not unlike Hong Kong that the British occupied before they occupied Hong Kong during the Opium Wars and had sort of their colonial base there off the coast of mainland China. C, it is a major city in the Philippines that, like Singapore, was a trading center in the 1800s and 1900s and going back farther, that in the 1800s, the Spanish, the British, the Chinese, the Malaysians, the Portuguese, and the Arabs all had their own sort of enclaves there with their own police force and legal system, sort of like New Chuzan has the enclaves with their own forces.
Got it. Or like the pirate hangout in Black Sails.
Or like the pirate hangout in Black Sails. Yeah.
Which is worth a watch. Oh, God. You're very good at these. You're very good at writing. You're very good at writing the like possible outcomes of them. I'm going to go with B.
Yeah, you're correct.
Yeah. C was a little too on the nose.
Yeah. There's also there is a city that similar to what I'm describing in the Philippines called Luzon, too. So there's a little bit.
Yes, you're right. There is one of those.
So that was a bit of a trick. That was a bit of a like maybe if you had that in your brain, it would sound just familiar enough. I don't know much about Chuzan, but there's a book about it, and it did figure into the Opium Wars, and it would make sense that if the British were going to form a new island off the mainland, the Atlantans.
Early in part the first, Hackworth and Fiona kind of have this like odd experience where they go and he is kind of drawn to meet someone, basically in the woods, like in the woods of the Pacific Northwest. And this person is part of a file called, I think, the First Distributed Republic or something like that. And they have a curious way of maintaining trust within their file. Hackworth and Fiona get to view one where the woman bungee jumps not knowing if another member of her file has actually attached the ropes in time. Another way of checking this is put forward in the book. And the thing that I'm looking for is what is that other test? And I will also give it to you in multiple choice.
Okay.
So one option is that the person one of the people who's being tested discovers a noose that is set up for them. And they have to go ahead and hang themselves, not knowing if the other person has detached the noose from its secure point in the ceiling. The other one involves a gun being loaded. The person has to load the gun, leave the room. The other person has to return and unload the gun. And there's no way of knowing if that has, in fact, occurred. And then the third option is about you have to go to a car and start driving, not knowing if the brake lines have been repaired on time. Which one of those is the actual thing that is offered as another example of the way that this file maintains trust in its group?
It's very clever of you to include the noose, since during dramatis personae there is a noose that is employed.
Yes, there is.
But I believe it is the gun, the loaded and unloaded gun. But I'm glad you gave me multiple choice, because I could not remember, especially in my 5 hours of sleep last night, addled brain that I have right now. I was like, I had actually read recently Michael Pollan's chapter in The Omnivore's Dilemma about eating mushrooms. And so what I had in my brain was somebody putting out mushrooms that have to be double parboiled before you can eat them.
That's a great
and not
one.
knowing whether or not they had been double parboiled or not. But I was like, that's not right. I think that's Michael Pollan. I'm merging books in my brain.
I would have loved that. So, well, we are we have our final question that we do at the end of a book.
Yeah.
JPD, are you going to read this book before you die?
I think so. If I make it to my 80s, I suspect I'll probably read it one more time. Maybe not in the next decade, but I feel like there's still something in this book for me to kind of. I think if I read it again, I would encounter new interesting things, and that would be an interesting experience. And I hope that Stephenson will continue to write fascinating books in the meantime, such that I will have there will be enough. There'll be some interest and some juice that might take me back to the Diamond Age at some point. What about you?
Yeah, I think I might read it again soon. This book haunted me in a way that I really did not expect it to, and I really enjoyed living in it. I just have to know if I finished it when I was a teenager. I don't think I did, but I really thought that I did. Well, tell us what's up next. What's going to happen?
So the next book that you should start reading, if you're still cool with this plan, our plan is to do Cryptonomicon, the next Neal Stephenson novel, which I believe came out in 1999. And it is quite a bit longer than this one. So our plan is to do it in 3 readings. So read the first third of Cryptonomicon, more or less, and we'll talk about that next.
Listeners, thank you for listening. Thanks for hanging out with us and this wildcap reading of Neal Stephenson's The Diamond Age. Please rate and review us. A 5-star rating helps a lot. As we've said before, give us a 5-star rating. We will read it on the air. And a review helps a lot of other people find the show. But thanks for hanging out with us, and we look forward to talking to you about Marines and haiku and code breaking and Alan Turing and all of the things that happen in Cryptonomicon.
Submarines, gold, more Shanghai, and the Philippines.
Upper Middlebrow is a Small Point production. Chris Bagg and Jesse Dukes are the nanotechnologists, dirigible pilots, and judges, juries, and executioners. Music by Ben Pajak and Jesse Dukes. Graphic and website design by Chris Bagg. You can learn more about us at uppermiddlebrow.com. Thanks for listening.